Richard Black, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks so much.
So,
Happy New Year of the Dragon.
oh, thank you. Yes, it is the New Year of the Dragon. Yeah, we celebrated it. I'm Vietnamese, so we celebrated that in my
Really?
in my house. Yeah,
Well, I'd
and
love to go to Vietnam sometime.
my husband happens to be a dragon, so he was really excited about this year. And then
Whoa.
my mom had to tell him, "Oh, it's this hard year for you." Not, she says,
Oh,
"Year of dragon,
great.
this is going to be challenge year for you." He was all excited, thinking like, it's going to be a great year." But what people don't know about the new year is that when it's your year, when it's your animal that shows up, it
Right.
means it's the year you're to be tested. So it's almost like the accumulation of the
Right.
12 years of the
Mm,
lessons that you should have learned throughout the 12-year cycle. When it's your
wise.
year and you're like up to bat, and it's like, did you train, and are you going to hit a home run this year? That's really, it's
Mm,
not like, oh, all the, you win the lottery.
right.
When
Right.
it's your year, it's more of a test year. So that's just like a fun little fact of the Asian New Year, the Asian astrology, right? Chinese
They, they,
zodiac.
they're saying in China that last year, 2023, there was an uptick of marriages. And this year, the year of
Right,
the
babies.
dragon, there'll be an uptick of babies because
Oh yeah.
everybody wants to have their baby born in the year of the
Yeah,
dragon.
yeah. Especially if it's especially boys, like, so parents will really wish for a male dragon, and,
Mhm.
so when I brought my now husband around, when he was just my boyfriend, my family was really like, "Ooh, a male dragon, we don't have one of those in the family yet, we need one."
Okay.
Yeah, so, well, thank you for being here. That's just a fun little fact for people if they wanna know about Chinese astrology. It's always really fun. I love astrology. I think it's fun and interesting. Tell us about your role. So you are with the Schiller Institute,
Right.
and you are the representative for the Schiller Institute at the United Nations.
Correct.
What does that So are you in New York?
Well, I grew up in New York. I live now in New Jersey, about 10 minutes from Manhattan,
Okay,
because the
so
real estate's so expensive over there. It's better to live in New Jersey. But I'm in New York all the time, meeting with ambassadors from nations from all over the world, putting forward the proposals that the Schiller Institute has put forward since 1984, when the institute was founded.
So tell us about what a day is like for you, meeting with people at the like, what types of topics would you bring up? What are you trying to persuade them to think or vote for, or how does that work? Just kinda give
Right
us an
now,
inside glimpse.
Right now, we're in an extremely dangerous international situation. The French president has announced he has plans to send troops on the ground into Ukraine in order to crush Russia. The German generals are discussing sending long range missiles into Ukraine to blow up the Russian Kirch bridge. The Poles and the Germans just met, and they're forming a special strike force to hit Russia. So we're on the precipice of nuclear war. It's so out in the open that not only courageous journalists like yourself get the news out. Newsweek this week has a story. What are the 10 U.S. cities that will be first struck in a nuclear war? So we have a very dangerous situation these hours and minutes. So the head of our institute, Helga LaRouche, the widow of the folk hero Lyndon LaRouche, she's a scholar and brilliant and courageous woman on her own. She put forward the idea that beyond solving these horrific crises in Gaza, Ukraine, Sudan, Haiti, we need to have an international conference to discuss the principles to get us into what she calls a new economic and security architecture, a new method whereby nations are in dialogue, solve problems, come to resolution. So mostly I meet with ambassadors from the great nations like China, Russia, Indonesia, to the small nations of Africa, Latin America, and discuss how can we act together to get a dialogue, a principle, one of the principles on the basis of a situation where each nation has their rights for economic development respected, uh, and in a sense, humanity as a whole moves forward. Is that possible?
What do you hear from them? What's the feedback from the ambassadors? What are their concerns? Do they have different ones? Is it just depending on the nation, they all have different concerns, or is there kind of a common concern, a common thread with the feedback they give you?
Among the giant nations like Russia and China, they're concerned because there's such poverty in the smaller nations of the global South, Southeast Asia, uh, Africa, Latin America. The nations are so poor that in most cases, each nation doesn't have its own intelligence gathering and evaluation capabilities. So let's say at the UN Security Council, you'll have, in addition to the permanent five, the big nuclear powers, you have a rotating group of small nations which are elected on a rotating basis. In most cases, those nations don't have their own global evaluation mechanisms, so they're handed a script by the US. So one of the worries of the bigger nations now forming this new international economic order typified by the BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, is to somehow upshift and upgrade the identity, the confidence, the knowledge of the former colonial sector, which has been so oppressed and in many cases being genocided. Haiti, Gaza, Sudan, um, others can be named. In case after case, you have nations which have absolutely the same rights as the large, wealthy nations of the North being crushed. So the question is how can we have the global South, as we call it now, or Lavrov calls it the global majority, which is probably more accurate? How can they be more and more an equal actor, mover on the stage of history, as, for instance, South Africa has become in the last year?
Yeah.
Exempt extraordinary courage.
So what about the small nations? What do they say? Do they agree? Do they say, "Hey, we want a place, we're poor, we are sick of being poor." Do they I mean, what do they say?
Yes, more and more that's the case. I mean, because Russia has stood up to this global NATO plan to encircle Russia and crush Russia, which is what the plan is, because nations like Brazil have stood up, and Lula is playing an exemplary role. He's saying, look, Israel is committing a genocide against the Palestinian people. This is what was done to the Jews during the last World War, and he
Yeah.
won't back down from that statement. So that quality of courage and the poverty, of course, as you know, in Brazil is tremendous. That's exemplary of a new renaissance that is unfolding among the global South. One thing that struck me over the last couple of years, there's a very small nation, you would know it, in the South Pacific called East Timor or Timor Leste. It's half of an island. I think it has 1.3 million people. Tiny nation. Well, one of the former presidents of East Timor, it was a Portuguese colony, is a good friend of Lula in giant Brazil. And what the ex president said to Lula 2 years ago, he said, look, Brazil, you have power. You should speak up on the war question in Europe. So this ex president of a tiny nation said to his friend, the president of Brazil, stand up. You can stand up. And Lula said, yes, he's right, and did it. So in my mind, that's an example of a tiny nation with a powerfully minded leader putting out an idea, and it begins to change history.
Yeah.
That's the idea of sovereignty. Vietnam, China, Russia, Paraguay, Mexico, they're all equally sovereign. You have to think about one has to think about that. What does that mean? How can a tiny nation like Eritrea be equally sovereign as China? Well, that's something for all of us to think about.
Right.
profound question, but it is the case, and it's enshrined in documents of principle such as the UN Charter. Well, we can go into it. 1955, the first meeting of the African and Asian nations in Bandung, Indonesia, with no imperial power there. Famous Bandung Conference in Indonesia, 1955, where Sukarno, the head of Indonesia, made a declaration that we're going into a new era. Colonialism will be ended. Now, it took a long time and it hasn't been ended yet, but there's been a process of the awakening
Yeah,
of the global South since at least the mid 50s.
right. So what do you think the power, going back to you saying that the smaller countries have just been given sort of a script by the United States of what to say and how to vote, and what do you think the power has been? What power has the United States held over these smaller nations to get them to comply with that?
Usury, money. I mean,
Mm,
as you would know, Kim, the International Monetary Fund uh, basically doles that money to these impoverished nations on the basis of what are called conditionalities. That is, you're impoverished, you've never been allowed to industrialize. All you do is sell raw materials to the North, and we in the North set the price of the raw materials. Many of your viewers probably know in Africa, all what are called the Francophone nations, the French speaking African nations. Do, do your listeners know where the currency of those nations today is printed? Paris.
hmm,
They know where all of the reserve funds of those French speaking former colonies, where the reserves are all kept? Paris. So nations were given political freedom, but they're still economically crushed. And
okay.
it's money, the International Monetary Fund, and dictates to a nation, well, we'll give you a loan. They're doing this to Pakistan now. We'll give you a loan if you implement these kinds of changes, which usually means slashing social systems, education, medicine, it's infrastructure, etc. It's a kind of clamp, never allowing the economic development, which now is being demanded and actuated by things like China's Belt and Road Initiative.
Right. What's interesting about that is the criticism that we hear here in the United States about the Belt and Road Initiative, or in particular China's investment into Africa. So China's been
Mm,
doing a massive amount of investment into Africa
right.
that pales in comparison to the amount of money the United States puts into Africa.
Mm,
And one of the criticisms that often comes up is, well, China's just indebting these countries.
mm,
Yes, they'll give them shiny new bridges and roads
mm,
and some
mm,
infrastructure, but
mm,
at the end, these countries are just indebted and enslaved to China economically. But what you're describing is the same system. These countries are indebted and enslaved to these Western nations that are still controlling them economically. But then my question is, but are we building them any roads, any shiny new buildings and infrastructure? I mean, look, if I'm going to be in debt to somebody, if I have to pick and choose, at least like right now I'm in debt to a bank, right? I own a house, I have a mortgage. I mean, that's just the American way. The way we
mm,
built our entire nation is through this sort of debt, right? We take out loans, we build something new and shiny, and and then we owe the bank forever,
mm.
for decades and decades.
Right.
Well, if I'm going to owe somebody something, if I'm going to be if I'm going to be tethered to somebody financially, then I'd rather at least have a house than
Mm,
nothing at all, right? And be
right.
just tethered financially, like them, like what we're kind of been seeing is this sort of shift towards debanking people and basically saying we won't even let you eat, you know. So we're holding the financial purse strings. We're going to
Exactly.
debank you. We're going to kick you off PayPal, kick you off of Venmo, kick you off of all of these things. You won't be able to
Mm,
make money. You won't be able to make a living. That's one way to do it. Another
mm,
way is to say, I'll lend you a bunch of money. You can build yourself a house. You can create yourself a business. So, in which it sounds to me like, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds to me like the way the United States has been, or even the West, I should say, has been economically hamstringing these countries is through the sort of the debanking method. We will debank you if you don't. adhere to the way we want. Whereas China seems to be saying, do you want a loan for a shiny new building? Like, does that sound about right?
Well, I think I should be interviewing you. You have it exactly right. I met with a senior ambassador quite a while back, a number of years, from Malawi in the southern part of Africa, and I asked him the same question that you're asking me. I said, "How do you view China's investment in your country?" So he said, "Well, I can tell you, in the last years, what they built here in Malawi is they built a new giant sports stadium for soccer. They built a legislative complex, which we never had for the government, and they built our first science and technology university." So he said to me, "Well, what do you think?" So
Yeah,
that so China is a 5,000-year-old civilization. 5,000 years. America is a couple of hundred years. So China thinks in the long
right,
term.
right.
And some of their best economists today, like Justin Ifu Lin, use the term patient capital. This addresses what you're bringing up. Chinese idea is we'll give you a loan, but it's patient capital. You pay back over 30 years.
Right.
And our expectation is, since we're investing in building metal processing plants or hydroelectric dams producing electricity, in the course of a 30-year series of production cycles, that improvement of nature and the building up of the infrastructure of your nation will allow you to make a physical economic profit, which you can turn into a monetary profit where you can easily pay back the loan over 30 years, like your
Hmm.
mortgage.
Right.
I mean, it used to be young couple gets married, he's 21, she's 18. Okay, this is in the old days.
Yeah.
Oh, it'd be nice to have a house. Okay, you go to the bank. Okay, oh, you can have a house, but you don't have any money. Uh, we'll pay for it. You pay us back in a mortgage over 20 or 30 years. Well, if they're working and raising a family and have a steady job, maybe the guy works for General Electric and he's going to work there for 30 years, then he can easily pay it back.
Right.
So there's nothing wrong with debt as long as it's not usury, and the purpose is to improve the cognitive and the moral and the physical standard of that young family. And
Right.
that's the Chinese approach. It's very Confucian. And, the
Well, and
Chinese
it's
use
actually it's very American. This is what's so odd
Yes,
about it is
absolutely
that
right. Yes, you're right.
that's how we built everything in this country was through going to the bank, getting a loan, getting yourself a house, starting a business, whatever it is, even buying a car, right? We do all of these things through loans, and they're usually student loans. They do become, though, from time to time predatory, right? So we do have a difference
Yeah.
between the good kind of loans and then the predatory loans. And we try to crack down on predatory loans. I think student loans for college have become predatory on those students.
Absolutely.
Um, but so we see, but it doesn't mean just because some of the institutes are predatory, some loans are predatory, doesn't mean we get rid of the entire system altogether and say, well, we just don't even want anything to do with that because it's the entire thing is predatory. There are
Mm.
some benefits to it, of course. So it's interesting. So it's really interesting to me to hear that criticism from people of, oh, they're just indebting Africa, they're enslaving them with this debt. And it's like, well, that's super American. That's all of us are here in this
Well,
country.
that's the lying media. That's the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. They know they're lying
Yeah.
because it's racist. They hate Asians. They hate Chinese, and they have this Anglo-American sphere views that we're the golden billion, and we're going to rule forever.
Yeah.
So now the global South is standing up. There was an extraordinary meeting of this BRICS grouping I mentioned. You're familiar with
Yeah.
Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. Extraordinary meeting in South Africa last August, and 5 new nations joined the BRICS, and they have their own bank. Speaking of banks, the New Development Bank, headed up by a brilliant, courageous woman, the former president of Brazil. It's called the New Development Bank, which is being built up to make long-term loans into the global south for economic development. Within weeks after this extraordinary advance of the global south, Gaza blows up. Now, I can't prove that that was done in order to break up the tremendous political forward motion of the global south, but all of a sudden, the Southwest Asia, the Middle East, as they call it, is a huge focus of a horrible genocide,
Yeah.
throwing the world into turmoil. So there are sort of two modalities going on:
Right.
this historic end of colonialism, and at the same time, a dying economic system, in Wall Street in the City of London, which is hell bent on keeping its power. War in Ukraine, war in the Middle East, Sudan is a horrible situation. Haiti, what an obscenity at America's door. China, by the way, as I know you read, a couple of years ago, worked out a master plan for the rebuilding from the ground up of the capital city of Haiti, a port system, and the U.S. vetoed it. So it's a chaotic death system at America's door. This can be changed. That's our message. It can be changed.